Well, I have no doubt that we will be blessed by God through Bob Turner next week. But for tonight, we're going to be in Hebrews 13 once again and just look at a text from there just a little bit closer. As we think about, just religion in general, as the Hebrew writer has presented, the Old Covenant and the Jewish religion, even religions today, you look around and see how they can be so tied to physical things. Things like idols in pagan religions, or temples, or tapestries, or sculptures. And in the case of Judaism, one of the more physical aspects of the Jewish religion is the altar. The altar, of course, was the place, the physical thing that you could see, that you could touch, and that way you knew you were being religious. It became a symbol. It became maybe in some ways an idol in and of itself. This is the place where sacrifices were made, but the Jews were not the only ones that had altars. It was a pretty common idea at the time. Most other religions, actually, throughout that time, and even historically after that, even into the New Testament days, had altars. This is just a place that you could make a sacrifice to any kind of God. And so to make note of a religion that didn't have an altar would actually be laughable. It would be almost ridiculous, because really how great could you be? How great of a religion and a God could you be if he wasn't worthy of any kind of sacrifice? And so to have no altar at all just didn't make sense to the Jews or really any other religion for that matter. So that being the case, it was really difficult for the Jews trying to transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament, following God, being serious about doing what God wants them to do, but understanding that that wasn't part of that, moving from Judaism to Christianity. See, in Christianity, there aren't all of those things. There are no temples, there are no tapestries, there's no altar that you can go to and that you can offer sacrifices on. And so it's so much different. What kind of religion could this really be? But the Hebrew writer wanted to clear up that misunderstanding by saying, no, you're wrong in thinking that. We have an altar. And clearly it's not the typical altar. So what is it? What is he talking about? What is he referring to, and what does he mean here in Hebrews chapter 13? Let's read verses 8 through 16. Hebrews 13, starting in verse 8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods, which have not benefited those devoted to them. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Through him, let us continually offer up sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So we looked at this last week, but let's just maybe look at it from a different angle or a little bit deeper. These are the closing remarks of the Hebrew writer. And really what we're seeing is a comparison. So some things that we're turning away from, that we look away from, to the things that we're looking to. We turn away from those things that we participate in these things now. We leave behind some things of old, and now we take in as new parts of our lives. The place where we get real strength, the place where we get real salvation, versus the things that are really just fake, the things that were merely a shadow, the things that really weren't the full picture that God wanted us to have. We're going to leave those behind. And so he basically highlights three particular things that we're leaving behind and the things that we're looking toward. And the first we'll put like this. He says, grace is now our strength, not food. Again, he says in verses 8 and 9, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods, which have not benefited those devoted to them. So clearly, there were some strange teachings that were going on. That's really the context that surrounds our main verse of verse 10. Some things that they were being told, maybe some things that they were used to doing, but they were not right. They were false teachings. In particular, he highlights the idea of what to eat or what not to eat. That had to do with the false teachings. These diverse and strange teachings are very clearly contrasted with the truth of Jesus, the unchanging nature of Jesus, right? Verse 8, Jesus Christ is the same. Unlike these strange teachings that change from year to year, something new comes along and people follow that fad. No, Jesus is the same. He's stable. He's cemented in the truth, and he is unchanging, and the gospel of grace is what we need to stick with. Don't be led away by diverse and strange teachings. What's really good is grace. It's good for the heart to be strengthened by grace. The food thing doesn't matter, not by foods, which have not benefited those devoted to them. Now, what's interesting is we don't exactly know what they're dealing with. I mean, we can make some assumptions, but we don't know the specific diverse doctrines, the strange teachings that are being offered. We just know that they're about food. So it might do us some good to sort of brainstorm a little bit. What could they be struggling with? Or in other words, what were some of the common concerns dealing with food at that time? John?
Paul will talk about the challenge they have of eating food off the idols.
Right. Right.
And of course, he says that's not an issue, but
right.
Watch out, because I'm son-in-law. That could be part.
Yeah, I think so. We think of Paul and how he, I believe it's in Romans and maybe other places, where he says, don't worry about food that's been offered to an idol. That doesn't mean you can't eat it, you can't partake of it. That might have been a struggle. Any other thoughts? What could they be dealing with? Some strange teachings regarding food.
What could they just be Gentiles that ate food they had not seen before?
Could be. Could be. Just new food, strange food. Gentile food. What else?
Food was laid down sheep, forbidden food before.
Right, so in the Old Testament, there were certain things you could eat as a Jew and certain things you couldn't eat as a Jew. Maybe it's just the basic teaching of that's now gone away under the New Covenant, but it's become false teaching and could be referred to as strange teaching here. Certainly think so. Any other ideas or thoughts? Because what's kind of interesting is not a lot has changed. There's still many religions out there that teach things about food. So what are some of those things? Some modern, strange teachings regarding food. Well, yeah, except fish, I think. But there were certain, during the time of Lent, Catholics teach you can't eat meat on Fridays. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Good Friday, I believe, is the idea there. That's certainly one.
I know my cousin wouldn't eat meat on Friday.
Well, it's strange because it's on our calendar. And if you go to school, I'm not sure anymore, but I know when I went to school, they served fish on Good Friday. It was that common. That teaching had pervaded most people. At least they know about it.
When I was in school, we had fish every.
You had fish every Friday.
Yeah, because that was still a restriction.
Okay.
They had not lived it that yet.
Interesting. Any other things you've heard or seen, people that you know, strange teachings, religious teachings about food? Oh, here.
Well, meats that are halal in Islam, they have been sacrificed a certain way and prepared a certain way, so I'll say slaughtered, but also accompanied with a prayer to Allah when they make that slaughter, when they do that. So, that's, and then it gets the halal branding, and then it can be sold and eaten by Muslims.
Okay.
It just...
So it can be eaten by anybody, any Muslim. It's just it means more to you religiously as you eat it. That kind of idea, you think?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, Christina.
I had a student come to me one day after school, and he was talking about food, and he said that, well, it says it right there in the Bible, you should not eat meat. And I said, well, now, if you're talking about Daniel, that's right. But he did that for a specific person. But they're a little tiny sect of the Seventh-day Adventists,
They don't eat.
and they are vegetarian.
Interesting. I was thinking maybe he was talking about Genesis, pre-flood. Everything was vegetarian, actually, man and animal, right? Any others that you can think of?
Or we've got diets out there that they say this is the Bible diet. It's right there in Scripture.
Yeah. Well, I bet Daniel's diet would be pretty good. Water and vegetables. It'd be good for you, I should say. But yeah, that's an interesting point. People claim the Bible when they kind of come up with a diet. That's interesting. So this idea of food, and of course it pervades lots of different things, but it's interesting how food still is a teaching regarding religion in certain places, certain types of religions. You think about how the Corinthians were concerned about whether the meat they were eating would have been sacrificed to idols, 1 Corinthians 8, as John brought up. You think about Peter in Antioch. He went back to the clean meats of the Levitical dietary laws. He refused to eat with the Gentile Christians, and in Galatians 2, he got in trouble. He was rebuked for that. He was trying to go back to the old. Think about Paul in 1 Timothy 4 or Colossians chapter 2. Seems to be dealing with a tendency toward asceticism, which asceticism is just basically a deprivation or even to the point of abusing the body in order to lift up the spirit, so you don't eat or you kind of abuse your body by way of eating. That was a pretty common philosophy that Paul had to deal with. Greek philosophy probably influenced those who held this view, and Paul may have been addressing what ended up being the beginnings of Gnosticism. And so there are a lot of actually things referring to food that the New Testament Christians were dealing with, that any number of them could have been what the Hebrews are looking at. But whatever the specific error is, what the Hebrew writer is trying to get them to see is not something out of the blue. It's consistent with the New Testament will of God. It's consistent with the rest of the New Testament regarding food. That food basically has no religious meaning whatsoever. It does nothing for you or against you regarding God in the New Testament. So Paul says that those who command abstinence from food are actually the ones paying attention to demons. 1 Timothy 4, 1 through 3. In another place, Romans 14, 17, the kingdom of God is not about eating and drinking. And then he also says in 1 Corinthians 8, 8, food will not commend us to God, neither if we eat, not we are for the worse, not if we eat for the better. So he says it really doesn't matter at all. So eating certain food, refraining from certain food, what the Hebrew writer here is saying is not going to be what saves you. That's not going to be what calls you to be religious. That's not going to be what makes you spiritual. But also we could apply that lots of ways, right? How many times you enter a church building is not going to be what saves you. The type of clothes that you wear or the fancy words that you use in your prayers is not going to be enough to save you. They're not titles. It's not about knowledge. It's not about knowing the right people. God's grace is what the Hebrew writer is pointing to. Don't be led away by strange teachings regarding anything else about what you could do or say or somehow earn salvation, but it's good for the heart to be strengthened by grace. It's God's grace that saves us. So whether food or something else, we can't let anything else be our strength. We can't let anything else be to us our salvation. And so we need to focus on grace, he says. Another thing we turn away from and that we turn toward is, of course, that Christ is our altar and not the Jewish altar. We find that in Hebrews 13 and verse 10. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. So first he said we turn away from this idea of foods, we turn toward grace. Now we've got to turn away from the Jewish altar and we turn toward Christ as our altar. What's interesting is pagans looked to Christians at this time as atheists. And that doesn't make sense, right? Christians, the people who truly follow God the right way, were seen as followers of no God. In fact, they were against God by all those pagan religions at the time because they did not have a visible God. They did not have an idol. They did not have altars. They did not have a sacrifice. Therefore, they must be atheists. That's how a lot of Christians were actually seen. And so somehow, whatever exactly is the problem, something in that area, the Hebrew writer is trying to deal with. No, don't let people make you think, well, maybe we're right. Maybe we really don't have a God if we don't have an altar. No, in fact, we have an altar. We do have an altar. This is a response to anyone who may be looking at Christianity as ridiculous because they don't have an altar. There's nothing physical about your religion. There's no sacrifices. How could this be anything religious or spiritual? No, in fact, we have an altar. So we understand that the word altar in this case is a literary term. He's using the word altar to stand for the sacrifice. So specifically or literally, we don't have an altar. We have a sacrifice. Jesus is the sacrifice. He's using the word altar in place of sacrifice. It's kind of like when my wife says, go make your plate. Sometimes I say, well, they're already made. No, what she's saying is go fashion, don't go fashion the clay and fire up the kiln. She's not saying go make the plate, right? She's saying go put the food on the plate. So we understand those kind of terms. This is a technical term in literature called metonymy. So altar is in place of the word sacrifice. It's just a figure of speech referring to a thing, calling it something, but it's closely related to the thing that you're talking about. So it's a common figure of speech in Scripture, so common that the average reader sort of just passes it over and doesn't maybe think about what exactly the Hebrew writer is saying, but it's good to think about and notice that. There are many actually examples of metonymy in Scripture. You think about drink this cup, as we talked about a couple weeks ago with Jesus dealing with James and John, the brothers wanting to lift themselves up. He says, can you drink this cup? Well, that's a metonymy referring to maybe when Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26. He's talking about the contents of the cup. Or Jesus is talking about suffering. Or you think about how Moses, it says Moses is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. Well, is that really talking about Moses as being read? No, it's talking about the writings of Moses, Acts 15 and verse 21. There's another one, a pretty famous one. You see the phrase Jacob and Esau. And in most cases, it's not talking about Jacob and Esau. Probably it's a reference from them well past having been dead. It's really a reference to the nations that descended from Jacob and Esau. For instance, Malachi 1, verses 2 and 3. So this is a great example of that literary tool. We have an altar. It's just a reference to Jesus as the sacrifice that goes on the altar, sort of in a hypothetical sense. Now we look back at verses 11 through 13. He says, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. So in the same way that the animals were taken outside the city, taken outside the camp, the sacrifice for sin on the Day of Atonement, they were taken outside, they were burned. So the Hebrew writer is using this to remind us that Christ was also literally taken outside the city of Jerusalem. And what he's saying there is he's saying, as he just said, Jesus is the altar, really meaning Jesus is the sacrifice. Now he's saying it in an even more direct way. Jesus is our sacrifice. Jesus is the one who was taken outside the camp. He was sacrificed for us. And so rather being in the city, rather being in the temple, rather being in Judaism, let us go to him. Let us go to him because he's the one that's going to give us our salvation. He's the one through whom grace comes, verse 9. So what this means is it's a call to break all ties with Jerusalem, all ties with Judaism. And the city is sort of that, again, that figure of speech saying you need to leave behind all those things of old. But really, verse 15 means the same thing. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is, the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. So he's talking about Christ being our sacrifice. But he uses that to transition into this idea that each Christian also offers sacrifices. So those that think, well, we have no altar, well, we have no sacrifices, we have no religion, really. What is Christianity? No, he's saying we have an altar, we have a sacrifice, and by the way, you still have to make sacrifices. Just because you're not bringing animals to be slaughtered and burned doesn't mean you're not offering any kind of sacrifice. He reminds us we have a sacrifice. Now, we leave the rituals, we leave the animal sacrifices of the law of Moses, we come to God through Christ, but now we offer sacrifices of praise. And also, he says in verse 16, things like hospitality and good works are part of our sacrifices. Now, many indications from this letter to the Hebrews show these Christians were trying to do both. If you can imagine how much of a struggle they were in, trying to participate in the Jewish religion on Saturday, but then reframe your mind and you go to church, do the Christian thing on Sunday. That's probably what they were trying to do. They were trying to do both. And so by doing both, they were forsaking Christ as their Lord and Savior. Because they were Christians, though, even though they would go to the temple as former Jews or still trying to be Jews, they ended up being the false worshipers to the other Jews because they knew they were Christians. They knew they had left the Jewish religion, or at least partially, and so for them to try to go to the temple and do that was forsaking the Jewish religion. So all those practicing Jews were denying them the right to offer sacrifices, especially if you think about Acts 6 and verse 7 that specifically mentions a lot of priests were brought over from Judaism to Christianity, how hard it would have been for them to leave behind that particular act of worship. They were being denied doing that worship, going to the temple. And so now they have to kind of make a choice. They have to consider, is this Christianity thing worth it? Because now I can't go to the temple. They're not letting me go. I need to make a choice, and they're starting to revert back. But what the Hebrew writer is really saying is instead of feeling left out, instead of feeling like you're missing out on the Jewish religion, what you ought to feel is compassion for those people who don't know the truth. You ought to feel compassion for those who are stuck in this old way that's doing absolutely nothing for them. What did he say in verse 10? We have an altar. You hear the excitement in that, the blessing in that? We have an altar from which those who serve the tent can't even eat. They have no right to eat. You think you have no right to go in the temple and that hurts you. No, they have no right to come to our temple, to our altar, to our sacrifice. Feel sorry, feel compassion for them. Don't feel sorry for yourself. And there's a lot of irony here. The irony is the fact that the writer refers to those who serve the tabernacle compared to those who serve God. And that didn't make a lot of sense. The Jews were God's people. They were serving God. They were doing God's will, right? But now they're not. Now they're not God's people. So if you're serving the tabernacle, you're against God. You're not following God. And so just reading this epistle makes it very clear that the writer does not consider a practicing Jew, those who are serving the tabernacle, to be those who are pleasing God. So, of course, he mentions the priests. Where is it? In verse 11. But also he's talking to everybody else, by extension, who are a part of this practice. All those who are involved in the service of the tabernacle, anybody who does any kind of Jewish sacrificial ritual falls under this condemnation, if you will. Those who still practice, who still sacrifice at the altar of Judaism, cannot participate in the sacrifice of Christ. So those who are trying to do both You can't be a Christian that way. You can't try to do both. You have to choose. So they were being pulled away by all of these difficulties. And it's hard to put yourself in their shoes. But maybe we ought to think about what are the things that pull us away? What are some of those struggles that try to get us to, I don't know, maybe be a Christian sometimes and be something else other times? What are some things that pull us away today?
Our activities that we have can pull us away.
Just get busy, right? Activities, yeah, worldly things, sure. It can be, certainly. John?
We've certainly seen an incredibly Christian aspect. Why should I go down there when I can watch it on TV?
Right.
And then that goes over. So there are those kinds of things to consider.
Yeah, just becoming apathetic, not being interested in religion at all. I read an article that this generation, Gen Z, they're about 25, I guess, at this time, and they are the biggest group of people in recent history that are not religious at all. So like usually, even the people that aren't religious can refer to their parents. Maybe they went to church as a kid. Well, they don't even have that. They talk about their grandparents. They've maybe never even been in a church building. Any religious experience or even understanding would be from that generation. So it's very interesting, those that are coming up. We do have a lot of people who are just either apathetic or agnostic. They don't know anything, don't even care to know anything about God. What other things pull us away, Christina?
I was still thinking about the people that were trying to blend both. And you know, in Acts, a lot of times the men, when they were spreading the gospel, they went to the synagogue.
Right.
And they talked to people there. They didn't just join in.
Right.
But I'm wondering if there was some amount of grace. What would you do if you were 75 years old and that was all you had done? That would be very, very difficult.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have much to speak to on that. I would agree with you that surely there's some grace. It's a transition period, right? That is an interesting thought and a tough one scripturally. We don't know exactly how that would have worked for those in the old system. Maybe they didn't transfer over. That's an interesting thought. What else? What pulls us away in our society today? What brings us maybe further away from Jesus? John?
I thought part of a program the other day that was kind of, in a way, kind of challenging the divine inspiration of Scripture. And if you listen on through it, it emphasizes that a lot of people don't know which Bible to go to or what Scripture to believe. And Satan has done a real good job of confusing the tongue sources.
Could we label that as just a really serious lack of knowledge? Maybe our culture and people in general are going through. Not only do we not know the Bible, but we don't even know where to turn, right? What Bible to look to, yeah. What about, the things they're promoting and teaching in schools? Of course, there's plenty of false religious teachings out there. Even just, things in our own lives. You've got work, you've got, could be relationships that pull you away. Sins, maybe new sins, or maybe sins of old that are rearing their head trying to pull us back in. It's interesting. I think modern day Christians have a struggle with working for their salvation. We think coming to church enough, or singing enough songs, or giving enough money, or doing enough for God, that's going to save me. That's dealt with here in chapter 13. Sometimes that's a struggle that actually pulls us away from Christ. I had down apathy. Yeah, there are a lot of things that pull us away, but what we need to take away, I think, from chapter 13, let's just listen as he says, Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. So let's not be pulled away, let's not be taken away, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. Yes.
I was thinking that the Jewish people had a definite way to sacrifice. They offered, they knew what they had to bring. And so it was, through lack of sacrificing the correct way, but they knew it. Maybe sometimes we as Christians, we run out of things to sacrifice. So how do I sacrifice? Placing myself in a situation where I can teach someone about the gospel. You're sacrificing your time. You're giving up your time to do that.
Right.
But maybe we're just running out of stuff to do.
Or we think we do.
We think we do.
So
it's not that we don't have.
yeah, we've plateaued, right? We think we've kind of reached.
And so when we lose interest sometimes.
Yeah.
You don't think you can do anything else.
I think that's a really good point, Jerry, that maybe a lot of Christians struggle with. We've done the baptism thing. We've made church a habit. We give. We've taken all these steps, right? We've taken all these sacrifices. Maybe we reach a point where we really haven't sacrificed anything lately. We haven't taken another step. We find ourselves maybe even thinking we've done everything that we need to do, right? And so that could be a very serious thing, pulling us away from Jesus, because that is never the case. That is never the case that we've done enough, that we've reached our goal, and that we are the hero Christians that we ought to be. There's always something, right? And we need to find that. We need to dig. We need to figure out what that sacrifice is.
It's easy for an animal, get an animal that's pure and take it to the altar.
Yeah.
And then do it over and over and over.
Yeah.
You knew what you were going to do.
Right.
And so.
Well, of course, there's several answers to that. One of those is just being in the Word. If you're in the Word, you're going to come to grips almost, daily as you read the Word. I'm not doing that. I'm really not living up to that. I need to be better at that. And then there are, 7 billion plus people in the world now, or is it more than that? We are never going to be able to get to them all, but we can try. We can try to teach, and we can try to baptize, and we can try to do what Jesus tells us to do, and that will never stop, right? There are never too many people that we can bring to Jesus. That needs to be our goal. There are always more things that we need to be doing. I think that's a great point, that we could sometimes feel like we've reached the height of our spirituality and have nowhere else to go.
You've done lots of programs. Some of these worldly leadership programs, not only bad, actually,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that, they will have a refresher course. Maybe we need to be refreshed.
Yeah.
And that can come any time in our lives
Mm-hmm.
when we have to make a change or reevaluate something. So, daily, perhaps,
Yeah.
yearly, our Christian refresher.
Yeah, a Christian refresher course. Of course, that's part of the reason we come to worship service on Sunday, not just to serve God and give to God, but also that's part of what that's for, refilling our cup and refreshing us each and every week.
We got a refresher course coming up this week.
We do. Thank you for another plug. We've got a refresher course this weekend. Bob will be here Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Be a part of that. That's exactly something that we need for sure. Okay, the last thing that we're going to look at that the Hebrew writer says we turn away from and what we turn to is that worship is now our sacrifice. No longer is it about animals. He focuses in verses 15 and 16. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So what I found interesting is you think about what is he actually talking about. See, there are a lot of different Jewish sacrifices, a lot of different days and worship feasts and all these things. And a lot of those, the worshipers ate what was sacrificed. That was part of the meal, the sacrifice. Both those who brought the sacrifice sometimes, and sometimes the priest who presided over the offering was commanded to eat as a part of that offering. But what's interesting about this particular sacrifice that he's talking about is it's the one that occurred on the Day of Atonement, and that is one that you did not eat. So the sacrifices on that day were specifically sin offerings, and they were not eaten by either the worshipers or the priest. So he's talking about them taken outside the camp, and at that place and that time, they were completely burned. So that's what he's referring to, a sacrifice that you don't eat. Well, what's interesting is that he compares that with the sacrifice of Christ. One point of the comparison is that neither sacrifice, the one on the altar of the Day of Atonement, nor the one on the altar we have, Jesus Christ, is eaten. Of course, that's a great comparison to make. But an interesting point that we could make is that there is a portion of our worship service that is eaten, of course, quite literally. So to think about the communion, which he's not talking about communion in Hebrews 13, but it might be an interesting application because that is a part of our worship that we do quite literally eat and drink. But anything that you do for Jesus, partaking of Jesus' sacrifice, what that means is that you're being a part of Jesus. You're being a part of the one who is sacrificed. That was the case under the old law, and of course it is under Jesus. So partake of Christ's sacrifice is to partake of Christ himself. And so when we worship regularly, we say, for instance, recall the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus by partaking of the communion, we are doing just that. We are partaking of Christ, not in literally the body and the blood, but symbolically, of course. And when we do that, we have to do that so very seriously. We have to make that a very important part of our worship. We cannot do that carelessly. We cannot do that occasionally. We cannot do that just when it's convenient or a few times a year. And so it's a great example of what the Hebrew writer is trying to say is when you're in, you're all in. You've got to do all of this and be a part of Jesus, every part of it, and you have to leave everything else out. So the priests ate of the animal sacrifice in other occasions, but in a similar way, what he's talking about is we eat, symbolically, we reap the benefits and the blessings of God when we partake in the sacrifice. So on those occasions where they would sacrifice and then eat, it was a blessing. They had a meal out of it, right? That was something that nourished them and helped provide for them. And so we eat in a symbolic, spiritual way of partaking of Christ's sacrifice. It benefits us. It blesses us, and it helps us grow spiritually. So there are a lot of these sort of, hidden things that he's referring to within this text that we won't go too far in, but could make a lot of great points for us. But remember, they're experiencing persecution. They're experiencing struggle. They're experiencing self-doubt about being Christians. I don't know. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been at a place where you think maybe I'm not doing the right thing, or maybe I need to give this up? And the reason they were struggling with that is because they didn't have any sacrifices. There was nothing that they could go do and they could point to and say, that thing makes me religious because I got blood on my clothes because I sacrificed on the altar. No, they didn't have that anymore. And so everybody else was looking to them and saying, what good, self-respecting religion doesn't have some kind of sacrifice? What kind of God isn't going to need sacrifices? But the Hebrew writer is reminding them, of course we do. Of course we still make sacrifices. We make sacrifices for God every day, all the time. He mentions praise specifically as a sacrifice to God, but also he's talking about life. He's talking about living. You every day. What is it? Romans 12, 1 and 2. Our bodies are a living sacrifice. He's talking about giving up our time, as Jerry talked about earlier, sacrificing our just getting involved in people's lives is a struggle. It's a sacrifice. We share our faith. And so whether we're talking about singing to God in worship or sharing our faith with others, using our lips in that way is a sacrifice. It's of great worship toward God. We use our lips, we use our hands, we use our feet, we share, we do good, we share our homes, we share our lives. We walk this earth continually giving because of all the things God gave, because Jesus gave on that altar. Because Jesus is the sacrifice. We walk every step. Our words, our actions must be praise to God, a sacrifice to God, right back to Him. And as someone has said, if you tire of worshiping God now, you're not going to like heaven very much, because that's all we're going to do. And so the Hebrew writer reminds them that's what life is about. We're just here to please God, to worship God, and we do that with our lips, with our hands, with our feet, with our very lives, because that's what we're looking forward to do for all eternity. You think about religion, and there are a lot of beautiful things. People travel all over the world to go see Rome, or some of these beautiful tapestries that are religious, or church buildings, or stained glass. You look at the fancy clothes, the robes of priests, and the beautiful sculptures that are religious, or yes, altars that are overlaid with gold. There are a lot of really beautiful things religiously out there, but I think what the Hebrew writer is tapping into is something that we still need to hear today, that all those things, they may be beautiful, but all they are is beautiful to the eye. They really mean nothing. They really mean absolutely nothing to God. They appear religious. They make you feel like you're in touch with God and make you feel like you're religious, but they really have no value in helping you grow, in helping you be spiritual, and helping you please God. And so what he's pointing to is Jesus. The real beauty is found in Jesus. The real beauty is in the fact that we don't need temples, that we don't need sacrifices, that we don't need altars or rituals. Our sacrifice is better. Our sacrifice is more beautiful, and we have everything we need and more found in Jesus Christ. Amen? So last week I kind of messed up. I made some paper copies of some things about the authority of elders, and I left a page out. So I've reprinted that page. I'm going to put it on the back table. If you'd like to fill in that missing page, you can grab that on your way out. I also want to say thank you to Maddie. She put together my slideshow for tonight, so I want to give her credit for that. Now we'll have another song.